Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy on KSFR 101.1 FM. Retake Our Democracy is a 30-minute radio show that appears every week on Saturday morning at 8:30 a.m. So good morning. I hope you got your coffee. I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. And today I'm going to be speaking with Gary Coffin, the Vice President of Indivisible Nob Hill, who will be filing an amicus brief to oppose Avangrid-PNM's appeal at the state Supreme Court of the PRC's denial of their proposed merger. If their appeal is upheld and the merger goes through, it would result in the colonization of New Mexico, as Gary will point out. I can't wait to get to Gary, but I do need to offer a bit of comment on Tuesday's primary results first. We'll get to Gary in just a minute. Last week, I did a solo show in which I discussed the failure of the federal government to address the urgent needs of our local communities, whether that be in relation to our personal safety and protection from gun violence, or our protection from the consequences of climate or the greed of corporate America, which takes advantage of every opportunity to take advantage of us. I also spoke of how our efforts to create change must occur at the local and state levels. I want to acknowledge that we are conducting this show on stolen Tewa land, and I want to thank our Tewa neighbors for being such good stewards of the land. They offer us a model that we should certainly learn from. Well, if anything we learned on Tuesday, elections matter. I'm fumbling here because I can't get to my page. Give me 1 second, folks. As a result of huge election successes in 2016, we fundamentally altered the political makeup of the legislature. And as a result, we're able to pass some hugely important legislation in the last 3 sessions: decriminalizing abortion after years of failed efforts, legalizing recreational cannabis also after years of failed efforts, capping predatory loans at 36%, also after years of trying, providing free college education for all New Mexicans, advancing the Health Security Act, passing a historic child tax credit that lifted thousands of New Mexican children out of poverty, putting a permanent increase in early childhood education on the ballot in November, and legalizing end-of-life options for those suffering with crippling terminal illness. Every one of those bills has a significant impact on vulnerable New Mexicans, and every single one of them could have been reversed if in this primary election a conservative coalition had been created. But that didn't happen. I'm not going to tick off the list of important wins, as by now you've probably read about them 2 or 3 times, but over 5,500 New Mexican voters used our endorsements to inform their voting. And suffice to say that we protected every Democratic House rep except for Roger Montoya. So we will retain a progressive majority in the Democratic caucus, and unless something bizarre transpires, Patty Lundstrom will not be Speaker of the House. And in the election of Raul Torres as Attorney General, we've put an end to the shameless pay-to-play system that has governed the AG's office for many years. We will hear more about that in a minute, as Gary works closely with Raul Torres and knows him well. So elections matter, and we'll be updating our endorsement page to hone in on the general election that's coming in November. Here's a spoiler alert for you. We will not be endorsing any Republicans. And we will offer more recommendations on local elections outside Albuquerque and Santa Fe. We'll have to work with our allies in Las Cruces, Silver City, and Taos for that. I want to be very clear, while Retake obviously played a big role in the primary, there were many, many other organizations who played important roles. It was truly a team effort, but I do need to call out the Indivisibles across the state in particular, as they play such an important role in educating and motivating voters. Now that the primary is over, Retake will begin focusing on the 2023 legislative session with a Zoominar series focusing on key bills we will be supporting and initiatives we oppose. We begin the series with our next huddle, July 13th from 6 to 7:30, for a discussion focused on gun violence prevention with Miranda Viscoli, co-president of New Mexicans to Prevent Gun Violence. At that huddle, we will discuss, what might be possible in 2023 by way of meaningful gun violence prevention, assault weapon ban, universal background checks, I can't tell you that right now, but join our Zoom huddle to find out more about specific legislation we can support and some powerful actions we are planning to create pressure on the legislature to act. You can get info on our huddles by going to retakeourdemocracy.org, clicking on the actions and events in the menu bar, and look for the Zoominars near the top of the page. Finally, I want to remind you that if you're driving around and miss any of this show, you can always check it out by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and clicking on Retake on the Radio. There's a button on the right side of the homepage. And all of our old recordings are there in living color, YouTube, not just radio. So you'll be able to see and hear Gary and I anytime you want. And you can watch it 10 times if you want. So I always like to, that's all the comments I really have. I want to get to Gary. I always like to let our guests introduce themselves, Gary. So how about you to start by telling us a bit about yourself and how you got involved in the Bernalillo County Attorney General's office and now working with counsel to form an amicus brief opposing the Avangrid-PNM merger.
Absolutely, Paul. Thank you so much for having me here today. I kind of got activated, I guess you could say, right after the Trump election. I walked into a meeting in Nob Hill, and there was 200 angry folks that were extremely activated, and it reinvigorated my desire to get engaged in politics. I like to say I'm a co-founding member of Indivisible Albuquerque, formerly known as Indivisible Nob Hill. And when I was in college in Hawaii, I spent a long time and doing a lot of volunteer work with Sierra Club. And in Hawaii, Sierra Club is extremely impactful because the tourism dollars are focused on the beautiful environment. Without the beautiful environment, you don't have money. And so, you know, it's interesting when I got activated here in New Mexico, which is my home state, you know, our money doesn't necessarily come from our beautiful environment. It should more so, but what we depend on and what our legislature depends on comes from a different source. And as a result of that, our political landscape looks quite different. But I took a lot of my lobbying work and efforts that I did in Hawaii and brought them here. And so that's kind of how I got engaged politically here. At that time, I had made the decision to go ahead and shift and go to law school. I started in San Diego and then finished at UNM. Graduated in 2020 and have continued staying politically involved ever since. Raul Torres actually came to Indivisible at one point, maybe a couple years back, to have a brief conversation about criminal justice reform. And I was very skeptical. I actually challenged him quite heavily because I didn't think that a prosecutor in the district attorney's office would have values that were similar to me. And that's kind of how I got involved in doing work with him, is that after challenging him, he invited me to lunch and we sat down and had a conversation. As far as the amicus brief goes, this really comes from, again, it's more pay-to-play politics in New Mexico, and we can get into that a little bit later, but I see some pretty concerning avenues for corruption that are you know, these are being paved right now, and I think it's important for progressives to stand up and fight against it.
So certainly another factor that must have, we'll get to the Avangrid in a minute, but certainly another factor that must have influenced your support for Raul Torres was Searchlight's exposure of the pay-to-play system operating in the Attorney General's office. What is pay-to-play and how has it played out in the Attorney General's office in New Mexico?
You know, it was the Searchlight article that really kind of activated me. I'll be clear on that. It raised my eyes to the reality that New Mexico for years have been operating under this political machine where politicians provide favors or I guess contractual work to attorneys or others in exchange for campaign donations. And this is a political machine that's operated pretty much since the Richardson era. I think if you take a step back and look at, Brian Colon and Hector Balderas and even Marcus Rail and the Robles firm, all kind of are born and bred out of that Richardson era. And this was general practice in the past, and we're doing our best to fight against it. And I think this election has shown that we made a huge step forward in changing and taking a turn.
So my understanding is that the Searchlight article didn't exactly report on the whole picture of the pay-to-play system, and that once contracts were awarded to these out-of-state law firms who were major donors to the Attorney General's campaign, those firms wound up not even doing the work, but rather subcontracted with an Albuquerque firm that Brian Colon and Hector Balderas had been partners in. That sounds so brazen as to be almost unbelievable. Did this occur?
Yeah, that's what my research has led me to understand. If you listen to Hector or even Brian Colon talk about their perceived operations of the Attorney General's office, they'll say a couple of things. One thing they'll say is that New Mexico's attorneys don't have the expertise to provide the services for these big cases. When I say big cases, I'm talking about Volkswagen and Monsanto, maybe even pharmaceutical litigation. And the other thing that they'll say is that because we don't have the expertise, that we should seek out firms that do have the expertise. But what you don't get is that those firms that they're seeking out, one, have already donated to their campaigns in order to have that relationship to know to go to the out-of-state firms, but two, that those out-of-state firms do indeed then turn around and hire one in-state firm. And Marcus Rael, the named partner at Robles, Roel, and Anaya, is actually the partner that does the work.
That's bizarre, unbelievable. I need
It's
to
a
take
kind
quick.
of a
So
circumvent. Sorry,
Go ahead.
Paul,
Go ahead.
interrupt. In a way, it circumvents the procurement process. And that's the real concern about this system, is that we have a procurement process for a reason. And rather than doing a sole source form and putting it on notice to the taxpayers in New Mexico that this firm's getting a significant amount of work, it's a kind of a workaround.
So what is Torres' plan for dismantling this system? And is it possible that what has been going on could result in criminal charges? Seems like it.
Well, I think criminal charges probably wouldn't be unlikely. I think the difficult part about that is that these are sophisticated actors that understand the political landscape quite well, and have been doing this for years. And so whether accountability will be faced or not is unknown. I think that Raul Torres' first plan, and to my best understanding, is that he really wants to expand the reach and expand the Attorney General's office and make it a point of accountability for the state. And that's one of the biggest challenges that many people have critiqued, or one of the biggest critiques that many people have expressed about the Attorney General's office for years, is that the Attorney General's office really isn't protecting consumers at the level it should. And these pay-to-play schemes actually negatively impact the protection for consumers. So he's going to focus on expanding that, hiring more attorneys, and making it an office that truly protects consumers.
So one of the things when I spoke with him, he referenced New York and California as states that operate very different kinds of Attorney General's office. Basically, they hire the expertise they need so that they don't have to go out of state all the time. You're going to have to go out once in a while, but by recruiting good attorneys and then giving them important cases, you retain them. Whereas in New Mexico, the Attorney General doesn't give the good cases to his own staff attorneys, and they just decide, I didn't sign up for this, and out they go. And so we've got a turnover problem there. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, that's very well expressed. I mean, attorneys need to be challenged. I mean, that's the reality of it. And when you have an Attorney General that's telling you that you should rule a certain way in a different case or pay closer attention to certain evidence and such, a good attorney needs to be unbridled and be able to do the job that they're hired to do. And we have that expertise in New Mexico, and we need to focus on fostering that.
Okay. So I need to take a little break here to remind our listeners that KSFR is more important than ever right now, especially with the era of misinformation that we're experiencing. KSFR offers timely news, fact-based news, imagine that, and also great programming, great music programming, and interview shows like this so that you can keep informed and entertained. But they can't do it for free. People like me do this for free, but they've got engineers back there and a sophisticated studio that they have to pay for, and that costs money, and so they need donations. And so when you get done listening to the show, I'd encourage you to go to ksfr.org, click on their donate button, and give them 10 or 20 bucks and view it as your ticket for admission with some great programming. KSFR is just a great resource to our community. Let's get back to our discussion with Gary Coffin. What other reforms might we expect from Torres, and why are they important?
Well, last night I heard Raul Torres talk about holding the feds accountable for the fires that have destroyed so much up north. That is going to be a significant focus, I think, from him out the gate. He also spoke about protecting women's reproductive rights. A thing that's interesting to me is he had noted that his mother and even grandmother have been afforded more protections than his daughter's likely to see in her future. And that I think that sits close to his heart. As far as modifications to the office, I think one of the most progressive things that I really have liked to like hearing from him is the setup of a statewide conviction integrity unit. And a formation of a conviction integrity unit would go a long way into protecting those that are wrongly accused of crimes, and focusing on storage and legislation that would protect DNA evidence and such to ensure that people who claim they're wrongly accused can get a fresh look.
It's certainly important. You and I had the opportunity to hear Deskovich. What was his first name?
Jeffrey Deskovich, yes.
Jeffrey Deskovich talk about his being wrongly convicted and spending 16 years in prison. And the process of quote unquote justice being served was so appalling, it was just unbelievable. And it's just hard to believe that any kind of scrutiny of that case would not result in overturning the conviction. And so, when we heard from Torres about that in Deskovich, we also heard that is probably not totally uncommon in New Mexico, that there are cases like that happen all throughout the United States. So it's great that I think that integrity unit is badly needed. At the very worst, if you have an integrity unit, then you can go around and validate that your convictions are legitimate instead. And one of the things that they pointed out when we went to that talk, Gary, was that in the Deskovich case, it took them 15 years to find the actual murderer, and that murderer had murdered again. And so it's not only that, Deskovich spent 16 years in prison for no reason. Someone else got murdered because they didn't capture the right guy. And they were satisfied they'd done their job. They got Deskovich.
Yeah, conviction integrity units inside, the Attorney General's office. That's a pretty progressive move for Raul Torres, and I think that would be a really good addition to our state to advance us and to ensure that prosecutors are doing their job appropriately.
Okay. Well, let's shift focus and talk about the amicus brief that Indivisible and Retake will be filing at the Supreme Court. Haven't ever done that before, have you?
No, this will be a first go for me.
Why is Indivisible opposing the merger? The opposition must be pretty strong to sign on to an amicus brief. Tell us why Avangrid would be bad for New Mexico and the litany of examples of fraud and manipulation that is part of its modus operandi. Let's start with Maine.
So, first of all, I should start by saying that we have a vertically integrated monopoly in the state of New Mexico, which PNM is our vertically integrated monopoly, which is overseen by the PRC, the Public Regulation Commission. The goal having a vertically integrated monopoly is to ensure that we have uninterrupted electric service and that the interests of the ratepayers are protected. That's simplified, but that's the base goal of it. Avangrid is PNM of Maine, Maine's utility company. They oversee it. Maine has had considerable problems with their utility company for many, many years. So much so that they pushed forth a referendum to actually kick Avangrid out of Maine. And their focus in doing that, Avangrid and their parent company, Iberdrola, put forth $70 million to prevent the Mainers from being successful in their attempt to remove Avangrid. That type of PAC influence in a small state is concerning. It's concerning for me as a progressive. It's also probably worth pointing out that J.D. Powers stated that Maine customer satisfaction was the lowest in the nation. And so with just those two things alone, the way that Avangrid operates is quite concerning to me.
Avangrid has also been fined and or expelled from Mexico and other south of the border countries. Most recently in Mexico, they got a pretty hefty fine. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I believe this is just last week. It was actually Iberdrola, the parent company that operates in Mexico, and they were fined $400 million for their operations. Basically, they were selling utilities, from the way I understand it, they were selling utilities to other entities that they were not permitted to sell to. And the Mexico government felt that the only way that they might be able to deter Iberdrola was through a hefty fine, $400 million. It's worth stating that New Mexico has a cap on fines that the PRC can issue. That cap is $100,000 per day. If we were to issue a fine at $100,000 per day, it would take us 10 years to get to $400 million. And I point that out because it takes a $400 million fine to deter a bad actor company that has assets in the excess of $160 billion. And this is one of the things that makes Iberdrola and Avangrid a dangerous relationship for New Mexico.
You told us just a little bit about Avangrid and Iberdrola's behavior elsewhere. What has Avangrid leadership told us of their plans in New Mexico? And why do they even want to get established in New Mexico?
You know, my belief is what they want from New Mexico is a couple of things. One, they want our beautiful resources. They want our sunshine. They want our wind. That is what they focus on. They focus on renewable markets, but I think they also want our transmission lines. I think ultimately what they would like to do is be able to connect New Mexico through to California and California down to Mexico. And you know, they make a majority of their money actually from selling from wholesale of electricity. And so I think that's why New Mexico is so attractive to this company.
They even referenced New Mexico as being a beachhead for them, which is sort of exploitive, if just to be kind. What was isn't there other commentary or testimony from the Avangrid and Iberdrola executives at the PRC hearing that gives you some pause or some concern that validates your concern about spending tons of money to get their way here?
Yeah, absolutely. They said that they would set up a PAC or a super PAC in New Mexico as soon as it became prudent for them to do so, meaning that if any entity were to set up and take a stance against Avangrid, they would use all legal forces necessary to oppose that, including setting up a PAC. That's concerning, because what you saw in Maine is that they funded a PAC with $70 million. In New Mexico, that would be the largest PAC that New Mexico's ever seen. We would definitely be fighting against a tide that would be difficult to overcome.
Well, and for those of you who almost lost your mind with the negative misinformation ads during this primary. You had no idea what we'd face if Iberdrola and Avangrid were trying to get a beachhead here. So that is of concern. So we wouldn't need to file an amicus brief if Avangrid weren't filing an appeal to the New Mexico Supreme Court. What is the basis of their appeal? They're appealing the PRC's verdict, right?
That's correct. So the PRC ruled that this merger was not in the public's best interest, not in the ratepayers' best interest. And they listed 400 pages of reasons why it's not in the public's best interest. And it's kind of amusing, but what the brief in chief appeal states is that if you take all the bad stuff that was claimed about their company's operations and you throw it out, this deal becomes a pretty sweet deal for the ratepayers. Basically what they're saying, and I believe it's $122 over 5 years is what each ratepayer would see as a result of this merger. So we would see a reduction in our rates of $122 spread over 5 years. And what they're arguing is that their operations in Maine, their poor customer satisfaction, they're working around the laws, setting up super PACs elsewhere, and putting profits over people. You take all that stuff out, and this becomes a really good company. And that's what they're asking the Supreme Court to do.
So they're basically, this is almost laughable. They're saying that the PRC should make their decision based on promises made by Avangrid, Iberdrola, and they should not consider their performance in other states and nations.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And this is funny because this even goes back to the Marcus Rael and relationship with the Attorney General's office, because the Attorney General's office represents a good portion of the ratepayers of the state. And somehow the Attorney General's office was able to turn course and decide this wasn't the best interest of ratepayers.
Well, we're about out of time, Gary. So if you could just give people the email, or not the email address, the website for Indivisible in case they want to find out more about you.
Yeah, come join us on a Monday meeting. It's indivisible-albuquerque.com, and you can find out all about us there. Thanks for having me on, Paul.
Okay, well, we're going to continue this discussion on YouTube, but that's it for the show today. We'll be back next week, I hope, with someone speaking about gun violence prevention. So join in next week, 8:30 a.m. And until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay active. It's the only way we fix this mess. Bye-bye. And by the miracle of podcast, we are back, or by the miracle of YouTube. So we were talking about the amicus brief and the and PNM's and Avangrid's kind of pathetic appeal to the Supreme Court. You've seen drafts of the amicus brief. What does it assert?
Well, it asserts 3 main points, and we can break this down a little bit if you want to go into the depths. But the basics is that Iberdrola's presence in New Mexico would shift the political landscape for decades to come. That's the first main point. The second is that we claim that the PRC was correct to be concerned about customer satisfaction based on all the atrocious activities of Iberdrola and Avangrid. And in fact, in that, we were pointing to things that have happened since the close of the record, since the conclusion of the hearing, because they continue to be a bad company. It's not like that they had a mishap and have changed course. No, they have a pattern and practice of putting profits over people. And then the last part, which to me is the most interesting point, is that I don't believe that Avangrid should be able to apply or reapply under the new PRC. I think that many of us probably remember that there was a constitutional amendment. I think it was Amendment 1 last session, or last it was November when we voted. And during that vote, we shifted to have the PRC now appointed by the governor and voted in by the legislature. And rather than having a 5-person PRC, we're going to now have a 3-person PRC. I think Avangrid sees an opportunity to exploit that PRC to allow this merger to go through. I believe that they shouldn't be able to reapply. I think that they've been heard, not without significant change in circumstances.
Okay, well, I thought I heard you say that the legislature has to approve of the appointments. Is that the case? I did not know that.
Yeah, no, it's the governor appoints with legislative approval, I believe, and it might be the Senate's approval, but but there is a second prong to that.
Listeners, we will check that out because that might be important if the governor is not able to appoint people that might stand up to the PRC. What is your thinking about ways in which, Indivisible, Retake, and others could influence the governor to make appointments of PRC commissioners with spine and who believe in science and economics and so forth?
That this is a tough thing. As supportive of the governor as I am, she's proven that she can be difficult to access at times, and difficult to really get her attention on certain issues. I think it's worth stating that under the new PRC, another modification that went through in that constitutional amendment is that the PRC commissioners are no longer barred from taking monetary donations from the utility company. As long as that monetary donation doesn't impact, doesn't lead to malfeasance or neglect of duty, it's open season now. And so, we just kind of dodged a bullet and took a good step forward in the Attorney General's office of getting rid of pay to play. But it looks like it could be coming again. And so I think the best thing that we can do is, 1, stay informed, and 2, make sure that we're at that table as soon as those discussions start talking, that everybody lets her know that we're listening.
So what would energy regulation and policy look like in New Mexico if Avangrid ultimately got its beachhead here? Avangrid is a 1,000-pound gorilla with no qualms about disregarding the rule of law. How could the PRC possibly keep them in check?
Commissioner Cynthia Hall stated on record that one of her concerns with Avangrid is that Avangrid is going to come in with so many subsidiary companies that it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for the PRC to regulate all of them at the same time. We just don't have the capacity. Iberdrola is a $160 billion company. They have company assets that are equate to a country the size of Ukraine. The PRC has 135 employees, and it's getting ready to drop from 5 commissioners to 3 commissioners. It's going to be very difficult. But I do believe that, one of the issues that we have with Avangrid is that they're really going to stifle competition in the renewable market here in New Mexico. And that, to me, is probably one of the most concerning things.
So, if it's such a good deal for Avangrid to come in here and take our resources and export them, wouldn't it make sense for us to do that and keep the profits in New Mexico?
Well, I'm hoping to see a bill this next session that talks about public power and public utilities. Really the way most of the world is moving is towards a public utility concept and public power. That's what we would benefit. And in fact, the regulators still have a purpose in that, but they regulate many different companies rather than one mega monopoly.
Yeah. Well, it would appear we have our work cut out for us, and there are, it looks like there may be some legislative remedies in terms of checking, who is appointed to the PRC. Are there legislative remedies for anything else in terms of regulating or opposing Avangrid? Could the legislature do anything?
Well, I think pushing forth public power would be a first strong step forward. That's the way to stop Avangrid for good, but it's going to be a heavy lift.
Yeah. Well, I know a lot of people who are out there already doing the lifting, so we'll see.
Good.
All right, Gary, I want to thank you for being so diligent in reporting on Avangrid and for your support for Raul Torres. And thank you for being on the show. It's a good show, but a bit scary, but better to know what's coming than to just all of a sudden get clobbered. So we've at least got an opportunity to fight back. And with people like you in the trenches, we got a much better shot. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks, Paul. I appreciate all you do for our state.
Okay. I want to close with this observation. There are generally only one or two or maybe three transformational bills considered in any legislative session. In 2023, there are likely going to be four: public power, public bank, health security, and meaningful gun violence prevention legislation. It's very important that we stay engaged in this process. The primaries are over, but there's more work to be done. The primaries, getting the right people elected, only sets the table for being able to get the right things done. So Retake will be focusing its work on engaging, educating, and motivating our constituents to engage their legislators in some old-fashioned constituent lobbying, like talking to your legislators in October and November about bills you want to see passed, not just sending them emails in January during the session when they're too busy to even read them. So stay tuned with Retake Our Democracy on the radio show and through our blog. You can sign up for the blog by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and clicking on the subscribe to the blog on the right-hand side of the page. And stay safe, stay healthy, and please, please do stay engaged and active. It's the only way we fix this mess. Bye-bye. See you next week.